All right, hi, folks who are joining. We're going to give it about 30 seconds or a minute, and then we're going to start with the webinar. See the participant count clicking up. So welcome to folks who are joining. We're just giving it a few more seconds, let folks get on the Zoom before we kick it off. All right, let's get it going. Welcome, everyone. I know I'm not the face you're used to seeing. Kevin Volpe is out of town, and so since he was on an airplane during this talk, figured somebody else should be standing into his place, and that's me. So welcome. I'm Judd Kessler, the Howard Marks Endowed Professor at the Wharton School. I'm an affiliated faculty member of the Center for Health Incentives and Behavioral Economics, CHIBE, at the University of Pennsylvania. If you're thinking I look familiar, that's because I had the pleasure of opening the CHIBE Virtual Research Seminar Series this September with my own book talk for Lucky by Design, The Hidden Economics You Need to Get More of What You Want, which you might see behind me. And now I'm very excited to be here back to talk to Professor George Loewenstein for a discussion of his new book, It's on You, How Corporations and Behavioral Scientists Have Convinced Us That We're to Blame for Society's Deepest Problems, which will be released on January 27th. So just in less than 2 weeks. We will make sure that a link to buy it is in the chat. So if you, and I encourage everybody to go do it. I started reading it this week, and I think it's great. I got an advanced copy because I was doing this. Let me introduce George Loewenstein, who needs no introduction. He holds the distinguished title of Herbert A. Simon University Professor of Economics and Psychology at Carnegie Mellon University, where his work bridges the traditional boundaries between disciplines to deepen our understanding of human behavior. He also holds visiting professorships internationally, including at the London School of Economics and the Brick Institute on Behavior and Inequality in Germany. Over the course of his remarkable career, Professor Loewenstein has been a founder and pioneer of both behavioral economics and neuroeconomics. His research has shaped how scholars and policymakers think about decision-making over time, emotions, curiosity, negotiation, health behavior, fairness, and much more. He has published hundreds of journal articles and book chapters, written and edited several books, and served on panels for institutions including the National Academy of Sciences and influential advisory boards for government and private organizations. His work has not only defined academic fields, but also informed real-world policy and practice. And of course, on a personal note, as somebody who has been doing research in these areas, his work has had a profound influence on me, and I'm sure on many of the folks listening today. So today we're going to hear George talk about It's on You, a book that examines how many of our most pressing collective challenges, from retirement security to climate change, are often reframed as individual failures that can be solved with nudges. But in the book, George and his co-author, Professor Nick Chater, argue that these approaches are not only limited in their effectiveness, but are sometimes used to draw attention away from deeper structural problems. So through examples that George are going to talk about, we're going to hear how corporations kind of push the responsibility onto us when maybe it shouldn't be ours. So with that, let me hand it over to Professor George Loewenstein. If you have questions during his talk, please put them in the Q&A, and then we'll have a healthy discussion. George will talk for about 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up.
Okay, thank you very much, Judd. Can you hear me? Okay, and you see that's the cover of the book. And Judd was just visiting CMU at the end of a book tour, and he was very exhausted, and he persuaded me not to do a book tour myself, or at least I have nothing planned at the moment. This is really the only thing I have planned. And I'm kind of glad to be doing this remotely. I just started watching this series. I bet a bunch of you have done the same, Pluribus. It's not really my cup of tea so far. But in the first episode, the main character is she's an author and she's signing books. And so one reason I'm glad to be doing this remotely is because I can't even kind of sign my own name in longhand, and I have no idea how I'm ever going to sign books if it comes down to that. And yes, I think when you sign books, Judd, you're supposed to say something, write something clever, and I can never think of anything clever to say. So anyway, it's good to be doing this remotely. So this is, as Judd said, this is a book about public policy. And why did Nick and I write a book about public policy? Because public policy isn't the main focus of either of us. And I think our motive was really just looking around and seeing what a mess things are, like the US and the whole world. So some of the problems that we face, high healthcare costs and poor health, which is particularly relevant to CHIBE, of course, inadequate financial provision for retirement. We have this um, defined contribution retirement system, which is really a euphemism for save for your own retirement. And the median person is going to be retiring on little more than Social Security. We have political polarization and misinformation. That's obviously rampant. And yeah, I just read a book titled Broken Code by a guy named Jeff Horowitz, which talks about Facebook's role in promoting polarization. But I think in general, the internet has been a huge catalyst of polarization. We have housing shortages and rampant homelessness. We have pollution. Some types of pollution, like water pollution, have got better over my lifetime, but now we're just being flooded in plastic waste. Have terrible violence problem. About 40,000 people die every year from guns. And we have a mass shooting, way more than a mass shooting is defined as four or more people getting killed or injured, not including the shooter, way more than once a day. We have school shootings regularly. In about the last decade, if we've had 57 times more school shootings than all of the other G7 countries combined. Of course, we have sky high opioid deaths. They've come down a little bit, but they're still very, very high. Automobile deaths, especially pedestrians and bicyclists, which is personal for me because that's how I get around. Poor and sinking mental health may be connected again to the internet. Rampant inequality, like since 1980, which is when a lot of the terrible problems in the United States started. Since 1980, the per capita income of the country has almost doubled, but median take-home pay has stayed almost constant over the same time that median per capita income has almost doubled. And that's just staggering to me. And then, of course, there's the mother of all problems, climate change. Why do we have so many problems and why do they persist? This is one of the focuses of our book. And in it, we contrast two possible accounts. One possible account is that there's a lack of known solutions. That is, we don't know how to solve problems. And so the obvious implication of that, if you buy that explanation, is that we should be doing more research. Another possible explanation is that solutions are known, but powerful interests are blocking those solutions. And so the problem or its sources benefit powerful interests who don't want the problem to be solved. What do I mean by the problem or its sources? Take something like plastic waste. I don't think the oil companies and the plastic companies want us want us to be flooded by plastic waste, but they want to sell a lot of plastic. And that's so the source of the problem benefits the oil industry and the plastics industry. Of course, you can already tell from the way I've discussed these two accounts that we come down in favor of the latter account. So, what are the best kinds of behaviorally informed policies for tackling these types of serious problems? I'm going to tell you a little bit of history, and we outline this history in chapter 8 of the book, which is titled "Sleepwalking into the Enemy's Ranks." Behavioral economics began around 1980. I trace it to the publication of Toward a Positive Theory of Consumer Choice by Thaler. And we began in opposition to the Chicago School. We viewed them as kind of their enemy, and particularly the hyper-rational, self-interested Homo economicus that's at the core of the Chicago School. Behavioral economics provides a psychologically richer account of human behavior. So they say discounted utility model, we say present bias, they say expected utility model, we say prospect theory, nonlinear weighting of probabilities, loss aversion, and so on. And so our goal was to provide just a psychologically richer account of human behavior on which to build economics. The Chicago School, because it believed that people were so rational and so self-interested, they were generally opposed to regulation and very pro-free market. So, like, for example, maybe the most famous Chicago economist, Milton Friedman, advocated for laissez-faire policies, shrinking government, against public aid to the poor, against public housing, against Medicaid, against Medicare, against Social Security, the FDA, the Consumer Product Safety Commission, Amtrak, the Environmental Protection Agency. Milton Friedman just hated anything that was kind of associated with government. And so it would have been very natural for behavioral economics, since we really viewed the Chicago School as our opponents, to take the opposite stance, to be pro-government and pro-paternalistic. For example, people aren't infinitely intelligent, obviously, so we shouldn't be asking them to decide between health insurance plans that they don't understand, which is something that I've done research on. People don't know anything about investing and they face crushing financial burdens. We shouldn't be asking them to save for their own retirement and to decide how to invest their own retirement nest egg. These things just seem obvious. Unfortunately, that's not what happened. That is, behavioral economics did not take the opposite stance to the Chicago's school's opposition to regulation and opposition to the free market. In 2003, two groups of us, Colin Kammerer, Sam Zakharoff, Ted O'Donoghue, and Matthew Rabin, and I, and Sunstein and Thaler, we both published papers advocating for a new approach to paternalism. We called it asymmetric, or they called it libertarian paternalism. And the basic idea is that it's often possible to implement asymmetrically paternalistic policies that improve the welfare of people who are behaving suboptimally without limiting the freedom of those behaving optimally, or really not without limiting anybody's freedom. Conservatives don't mind these kinds of policies because they retain the freedom of choice, and conservatives believe that they're not going to make any difference anyway. Like, for example, defaults on 401ks. Conservatives would never believe that they would make any difference. It's such an important decision that people are facing. And look at the titles of these papers: Regulations for Conservatives, Libertarian Paternalism. They were expressly intended to appeal to conservatives. In 2008, these papers kind of morphed into what's now known as Nudge, and based on the bestseller by Thaler and Sunstein. And nudges are very much not about the types of policies that Chicago economists hate. Nudges are, this is a quote from the book, nudges are not taxes, fines, subsidies, bans, or mandates. Putting the fruit at eye level counts as a nudge. Banning junk food does not. And if you read the book, you'll see that there are several references actually to Milton Friedman's famous book, Free to Choose. Better governance often requires less in the way of government coercion and more in the way of freedom to choose. To borrow a phrase from the late Milton Friedman, libertarian paternalists urge that people should be free to choose. So Nick and I both independently very early started doing a lot of nudge-related research, but we each started to have misgivings. And I first presented my own misgivings in a 2010 op-ed in the New York Times, which I co-authored with Peter Ubel, a longtime friend and co-author. It was titled, we didn't come up with this title, the newspaper did, but it was titled Economists Behaving Badly. And it was basically questioning whether a nudge was kind of up to addressing serious public policy problems. In 2013, I met Nick Chater. We met actually, we were both on the advisory board for the British Nudge Unit or the Behavioral Insights team, and we met at the holiday retreat in 2013 in Horse Guards building in Westminster, very amazing location. In 2000, and at that meeting, we kind of discovered one another, and we discovered that we were both kind of had misgivings about the approach that we'd been working on for many years at that point. And in 2017, we wrote our first critique of nudge. It was titled Putting Nudges in Perspective, Behavioral, and it was published in Behavioral Public Policy. And this is the table one from that paper, and it really kind of gets the essence of the paper across. Basically, on the x-axis, we have types of interventions, traditional economic interventions like taxes and subsidies, behavioral interventions like nudges, and hybrid policies like carefully framed taxes and subsidies. On the y-axis, we have rationales for intervention, traditional economic rationales like externalities, asymmetric information. At the bottom, we have behavioral economic rationales like internalities, bounded rationality. And in the middle, we have a hybrid of the two. And what we argue in the paper is that nudges are in this bottom right corner, but that there's a potential role for behavioral economics to play in all of these other different parts of the table. So we were arguing that behavioral economics is not used nearly extensively enough in public policy. We had other concerns. One is that the effects are not as large as what people believed. As I said, we did a lot of nudge research ourselves, and we were often disappointed by the magnitude of the outcomes that we saw. And this was kind of, our misgivings were confirmed by a paper by Delavigno and Linos in 2022. I'm sure all of you are familiar with that. Another concern was that, or is that nudges may crowd out more substantive S-frame policies. By S-frame, I mean systemic policies. And David Hagman, Emily Ho, and I published a paper in 2019 with a provocative title, Nudging Out Support for a Carbon Tax. And in that, we present 6 different studies, each of them showing that when you tell people about nudges, their support for fundamental policies decline. This is their support for a carbon tax when they're just asked about their support, and this is when they're asked about their support after learning about a green energy nudge. We have a new paper which just got rejected at the same journal, titled Costly Distractions, Focusing on Individual Behavior Undermines Support for Systemic Reforms. It sounds like the same, but it's actually quite different. In this paper, we just ask people to evaluate either nudge-like policies or kind of more substantive policies, and we show them the policies. We say, what do you think about these policies? And then we say, what do you think is the best way to solve this public policy problem? And what we find is that if we kind of prime them by asking their opinion about nudge-like policies, they tell us that the best way to solve public policy problems is with nudges. And if we prime them with more substantive policies, they tell us that the best way to solve the problems is with more substantive policies. So if you happen to be the editor of a journal, we have a paper that we want to publish on this topic. In 2023, we published a paper titled The I Frame and the S Frame. The I Frame is the individual frame, which involves helping people to play the game better, taking the rules as fixed. So this involves encouraging people to take responsibility, giving them information, education, and of course, nudges are I-frame policies. The S-frame is the system frame, and the system frame tries to work out why the game goes wrong and to find better rules, and it typically involves regulations, government initiatives, taxes, subsidies, and so on. We first posted this paper on SSRN, and we were absolutely overwhelmed by the response. The paper ended up, before it got published, it became ranked 395 on SSRN, which doesn't sound impressive until you learn that there are 1.6 million papers on SSRN. And even though the paper is only a few years old, it's already been cited by 824 people. The central theme of It's on You is a little bit different from the I-frame, S-frame paper. It's about how the rich and powerful, often with the aid of behavioral scientists, block progress. And in it, we talk about what we call the I-frame sleight of hand. The I-frame sleight of hand involves blaming the individual, but rigging the system. And in the first half of the book, we give a whole bunch of different examples of the I-frame sleight of hand. And I'll talk about a few of these examples now. First example is climate change. Obviously, tackling climate change requires S-level policies, shifting to green electricity, changing how we heat our homes, and so on. We'll probably need a substantial carbon tax and extensive regulation. What do we have? Probably the most ubiquitous response to climate change is that people have been encouraged to reduce their carbon footprint. And the carbon footprint is ubiquitous. It's in the New York Times, it's on government websites, and we're given instructions about how to do it. And we're told that there was just a New York Times article, or maybe it was Washington Post, which was about how we're not doing it correctly and so on. And who invented the carbon footprint? Of course, if you've heard me speak before or read the I-frame, S-frame paper, you know the answer to this. It was British Petroleum. And we learned about this from the climatologist Michael Mann in his book, The New Climate War. What was the old climate war? The old climate war was to discredit climate science, often with the aid of academics who, for the right reimbursement, were ready to raise questions about whether climate change was real. After a while, it became incontrovertible just from personal observation, all of our personal observations. It became incontrovertible that climate change was happening. So the oil industry shifted its strategy to what Mann calls the new climate war, to promoting the idea that climate change is each individual's problem and not industries. And this is a classic case of the sleight of hand that we're talking about. So the oil industry blames the individual, focuses on individual responsibility, like our carbon footprint. It mounts individualized attacks on climate scientists and advocates and their carbon footprints. For example, for flying to the COP meetings on private jets, it gives the appearance of wanting to help the problem, but then by helping individuals to solve it, knowing that the individuals are powerless. All the time, the same industry players are sponsoring climate science disinformation, undermining international agreements, funding political campaigns, especially of people who are climate deniers, especially in the US, and lobbying behind the scenes for new oil fields, fracking, and so on. Second problem, obesity. Behavioral economists have classically treated obesity as a problem caused by present bias. But if you look at variations in obesity over time and across countries, that reveals limitations of this perspective. There's no evidence that present bias changed over time or varies across countries in ways that explain these variations. And there's plenty of evidence that obesity depends on systemic factors. For example, when people migrate, they tend to take the obesity characteristics of the locality that they move to. And the food industry has embraced behavioral economics and advanced the idea that people are obese because they don't exercise enough and eat too much. And they've funded a lot of research, like, for example, Coca-Cola funded a lot of research suggesting that the problem behind obesity is not diet, it's actually that we don't exercise enough, and they funded a whole lot of scientists to make that claim. Brownell and Warner, Kelly Brownell has been a big player in this area. He's a food researcher. He and Warner wrote a book titled The Perils of Ignoring History, Big Tobacco Played Dirty and Millions Died, How Similar is Big Food? Well, it turns out that not only is big food similar, it's actually literally the same. A bunch of the tobacco players have gotten into the industry of fast food. Brownell and Warner described the industry's strategy for influencing public and policymaker opinion, focus on personal responsibility as the cause of the nation's unhealthy diet, the product of individual level decisions regarding eating and exercise, taking the food system as a given. Poor financial preparation for retirement. As I said before, the defined contribution approach to funding retirement doesn't work. It's just a euphemism for save for your own retirement, which is increasingly difficult for a variety of reasons, including that we live a long time after we retire. Behavioral economists have introduced eye-level fixes like auto-enrollment, auto-escalation, and many other individual-focused approaches. But auto-enrollment and escalation have barely moved the needle on retirement because only 50% of firms offer these policies. Defaults and match rates are set in an ad hoc fashion and typically low, and there's leakage because people, when they change jobs, they're allowed to withdraw their funds and they can borrow against their so-called pension pots. David Laibson gave a brilliant address to the AEA and the AFA in 2020 titled Nudges Are Not Enough, talking about all of these problems, and he's written a whole bunch of follow-up papers with his collaborators making the same point. Frank Pascali in The Atlantic writes, researchers have suggested that with the right behavioral interventions, citizens can solve the problem on their own, but the nudge is really a fudge. The most worrisome, unexpected cost of old age, including medicine and personal care, should be addressed by politicians via programs such as Medicare and Medicaid, but by focusing on individuals' decisions to save up for retirement, they can shift responsibility. This focus on the individual rather than the wider social context is not surprising, given that nudging comes out of microeconomics and psychology. Australia is the only developed country with a lower personal savings rate than the United States, but since it's introduced an S-frame reform, its superannuation scheme, it's vaulted to becoming a country with one of the best funded retirement systems in the world. Most relevant probably to this audience is high cost and low value healthcare. And it's interesting to note that the US wasn't always an outlier. And that's true for a whole lot of these problems, including, for example, obesity. But here's a plot, and it shows a whole lot of our problems started in 1980. And you can see that we were high, but not at the kind of mixed into the pack at 1980 when it came to per capita healthcare expenses. But then all of a sudden, our expenses took off. And this is what happened, a bunch of S-frame things. like the ending of mostly the ending of managed care, fee for service, and so on. Behavioral economists with a focus health health have hinted that high healthcare costs stem from individuals' poor health behaviors, mea culpa, and maybe it's good that Kevin's on an airplane right now. But we wrote in a paper in 2007, individual behavior plays a central role in the disease burden faced by society. Modifiable behaviors such as tobacco use, overeating, and alcohol abuse account for nearly 1/3 of all deaths in the United States. But the United States actually has a very low tobacco use and very low alcohol abuse relative to other countries. So that can't possibly explain what this dramatic divergence from other countries. As with so many of these other problems, we actually know what works. And Philip Longman wrote a great book, Best Care Anywhere, talking about how great the Veteran Administration healthcare is, and that's a model that we could easily apply to our whole society. But the health industry has fought such reforms tooth and nail. Um, and when Hillary Clinton tried to introduce healthcare reform, they mounted what was a Harry and Louise, I think it was, ad campaign opposing it. President Obama, who of course, now we have the Affordable Care Act and Obamacare, but Obamacare is a deeply imperfect healthcare reform, and he wrote about the challenges of enacting relatively modest healthcare reform. Unlike the insurance companies or big pharma, whose shareholders expected them to be on guard against any change that might cost them a dime, most of the potential beneficiaries of reform, the waitress, the family farmer, the independent contractor, the cancer survivor, didn't have gaggles of well-paid and experienced lobbyists roaming the halls of Congress. So I don't know if you've heard of the Bader-Meinhof phenomenon, but the general idea, it's also known as the frequency illusion. Once you learn about something, you start to see it everywhere. And that's definitely been true for not Kev, for Nick and for me. We now see this iframe sleight of hand everywhere. So plastic waste, if you I grew up with the Keep America Beautiful anti-littering campaign, and the most famous ad for that campaign was the so-called Crying Indian campaign ad. I highly recommend that you get on YouTube and watch it. And the ending of that Crying Indian campaign is very interesting. The ending says, "People start pollution, people can end it." Who funded Keep America Beautiful? It was the beverage companies and the packaging companies. And at the same time they were lobbying against bottle bills and anything that would hurt their bottom line. Now it's the plastic industry. The opioid epidemic. Purdue Pharma, of course, played a very prominent role in the opioid epidemic, and they consistently promoted an iframe perspective. Like Richard Sackler sent an internal email to people at Purdue saying, we have to hammer on the abusers in every way. They are the culprits and the problem. They are reckless criminals. Of course, it wasn't the users who were the criminals. It was Purdue. Gambling addiction. The American Gaming Association published a pamphlet titled Demystifying Slot Machines, in which they write, the problem is not in the products that players abuse, but with the individuals. Of course, they have these huge research centers where they're fine-tuning slot machines to make them as addictive as possible. Gun violence in the United States. I already talked about gun violence. And of course, what's different about the US? We know what it is. It's the availability of firearms. And the NRA advances what is obviously the iframe. Guns don't kill people, people kill people. So it's not that we're kind of flooded in guns, that everyone has guns. The problem is they often will say it's mental health. is the problem. I do actually think mental health is a problem, but it's not the big contributor to gun violence in the United States. Privacy is a big issue, and the industry's been lobbying for a notice and consent approach, and has resisted efforts at regulation. Misinformation, the industry, like Meta, has resisted implementing costly strategies to squelch misinformation. I already mentioned this book. I'm in the closing chapters of the book. Broken Code, I highly recommend it. Inside Facebook and the fight to expose its harmful secrets. Meanwhile, what have behavioral researchers been doing on misinformation? We've been doing things like developing games like bad news go viral to try to, quote, inoculate, that's a quote from the researchers, to try to inoculate people against misinformation. Obviously, we need S-frame reform to deal with the problem. Um, as I said, the Bader-Meinhof phenomenon is once you learn about something new, you start noticing it everywhere. And I said that's true for Nick and me. Just a few days ago, David Wallace Wells wrote an op-ed piece in the New York Times, and it was about the planning for the new pandemic. And here's a kind of a loose quote from his article. In the event of a sudden pandemic, what should we do? Jay Bhattacharya, director of NIH, argues that the country should focus on making the population metabolically healthy, that is, fit. Forget social distancing, masks, or even a next generation Operation Warp Speed. The best way to fight off a novel infectious disease, Bhattacharya writes, is to get the country into better physical shape before the emergency arrives and bet that our fitter bodies will be capable of simply fending it off. And this is a quote from Bhattacharya, that is by stopping smoking, controlling hypertension and diabetes, or getting up and walking more. Of course, I think that we should be encouraging people to do those things, but that's obviously not a solution to the next pandemic, but it's a typical I-frame kind of solution. The S-frame or the I-frame sleight of hand applies to politics itself, while ostensibly hand-wringing about government capture by special interests and about fake elections and things like that. At the same time, work hard to capture the political process yourself. Gerrymandering, lobbying, money in politics, industry networks, revolving doors. This is, by the way, chapter 10 of our book. It's titled Democracy Hacked. And we were very influenced by a book by Oreskes and Conway, a brilliant book titled The Big Myth, which is how American businesses taught us to loathe government and love the free market. And basically, the idea is to hijack media and teach people that the government is the root of all evil. Some directions we're taking this work in. We're still working on I-frame, S-frame stuff. We recently wrote a paper, an S-frame agenda for behavioral public policy research. People have often asked us, like, because we're all used to doing I-frame kind of research. That's what we're trained to do. And people have asked us, like, how should we change if we want to do S-frame work, how should we change our focus of research? And that's what we do. We provide a blueprint of how behavioral researchers can engage with the S-frame in their own research. One of the points we also make is that RCTs, which a lot of people think are is the gold standard for public policy research, RCTs have a built-in bias favoring I-frame policies. And we have a new piece that we're putting the finishing touches on, but it's a commission piece, so it is forthcoming, titled A Political Psychology of Inequality. And it focuses on pure inequality, not group level inequality, but pure inequality, like the the inequality captured by, for example, the Gini coefficient. And in this paper, we argue that individual level psychology, and especially the tendency to make local comparisons, distracts people from understanding or caring about income and wealth inequality. And it looks like I have a couple of minutes, like 2 minutes left, which is perfect. And let me give a final example just from a few days ago. I was driving in Pittsburgh. Actually, my wife was driving, and I asked her to pull over to the side of the road because I saw this sign on a bus shelter. Arrive alive. City of Pittsburgh is urging residents to be safe on the road. Vision Zero Pittsburgh. So I took a picture and then I clicked on this, whatever this thing is called. It came up with Vision Zero Community Agreement. At first, I was thrilled because I think I love Vision Zero. It started in Sweden. But then when I looked at in more detail, I was dismayed because it's basically a complete iframe approach to improving road safety. The idea is you're supposed to click on these different things and then sign a statement saying that you pledge to be drive better or be a better pedestrian or a better bicyclist. And in the United States, pedestrian and bicycle accidents they've been declining in all other advanced countries, but in the United States they kind of leveled off, and now they've been actually climbing in the United States while they continue to fall in other countries. What are the causes? Pedestrian unfriendly infrastructure, larger, heavier vehicles with high front ends that reduce visibility, and that also if they hit you, they're much more likely to kill you. Distracted and impaired driving, driving under the influence of cell phones, speeding. And in Pittsburgh, there's been a really dramatic decline in police enforcement. Like nowadays, there's really no enforcement of traffic laws. I've seen people go through red lights 2 seconds after the light turns red, and there's a cop right there, and the cop does nothing. It's so disturbing. It turns out that the I-frame or the S-frame sleight of hand, when it comes to traffic fatalities, and it's an old story. Tom Standage, in A Brief History of Motion, writes about how in the 1920s, cars became demonized as child-killing death machines in the early 20s, and it began to hurt sales. And the car industry comes up with a very interesting strategy. The problem here is not drivers, it's not the cars, it's not the road design. They weaponize one particular word, which is jaywalker. And this is an anti-jaywalking poster from the 1930s. Vision Zero, which is supposedly what Pittsburgh has adopted, was supposed to be something very different. This is from the Swedish website. They are the ones who pioneered it. It's an ethical stance stating that it's not acceptable for human mistakes to have fatal consequences. It can be viewed as a paradigm shift where the ultimate responsibility for road safety is shifted from the individual road users to those who design the transportation system. For example, the road management bodies, vehicle manufacturers, legislators, commercial transport operators, the police authorities, and others. Traditional road safety management, if an accident happens, blames the road user. Vision Zero assumes that it's human to make a mistake, but mistakes should not cost a person's life or health. In my view, this is a perfect example of how public policy can be done and should be done. And that's it. So, stop share. Almost on time. Let me.
Excellent. I will say that you were on time, and you gave the opportunity for lots of good questions to come in the Q&A and for them to be upvoted. So folks who are listening, if you have a question, please ask, and also upvote the ones that are most exciting to you. I will kick it off, the Q&A, with one of my questions, which you've teased a little bit in your slides as something that you were working on, but at the very beginning you said we don't need more research on the solutions. We kind of know the solutions; they're S-frame solutions. So if that's the case, what should researchers who are used to doing I-frame studies, like trying to encourage individuals to make different choices because we can do that with well-powered RCTs, what should we be doing in terms of research on these questions? And then we're going to get into some of the upvoted questions about, what the solutions might look like.
Okay. Well, let me say it's too strong to say that I didn't mean to say that we don't need research on solutions. We absolutely do need research on solutions. What I was really saying is that for so many of these problems, we know what solutions work. Like we can look at other, for example, we can look at other countries, or in the United States, in some cases, we can look at states where things are working. And so, by that token, I think we need more of the kind of international historical cross state research to see what and to see exactly what works. But um, the I think the most important thing we need, and this could actually be done with RCTs, but the most important thing we need is we need research to try to figure out how to shift public opinion in favor of the solutions that we know work. And yeah, RCTs, they tend to like you tweak something, and generally they're very expensive, so you can only tweak one thing. And my co-author Nick Chater said it's like playing 20 questions with policy making, because it's like and it's at very, very slow 20 questions where you can only ask one question maybe every half year or so.
So this dovetails with one of the questions that got a bunch of upvotes, which is, and relates to something that I was wondering. So the question is, do you agree that the S frame does not land as well with audiences as the I frame? If so, why is that? It seems like it is easier to create I frame messages that really land with Americans than S frame messages. And it dovetails with what you just said, because, if the part of the solution is getting these S frame changes, then what should individual people be doing, right? Instead of worrying about recycling,
Yeah,
a piece of plastic, should I be calling my congressperson? Is that the right solution? What is the right solution? And what are the messages that will be effective to generate S frame
yeah.
change?
Fantastic question. Um, I remember when I used to do iframe research, and I would give talks like public lectures or talks to industry, things like that, and people would love it. Like they just eat it up. And I think I think that iframe interventions and kind of nudges to some degree got oversold, but to an even greater extent, they got overbought. It's so appealing, the idea that you can solve the world's problems with these kind of little tweaks. And it's kind of like TED Talks. Like if you listen to TED Talks, you'd think that the world's problems could be solved by iframe solutions. Ask the question again. I'm trying to remember where was I
Well,
going.
it just what are the
Oh, okay.
messages that,
Yeah.
what should we be doing?
And then when I started doing S-frame research, I got such a different reaction. And I wonder how much this book is going to sell, because it's not a very fun public policy message. I remember presenting a talk based on the I-frame S-frame paper, not based on the book, in Vienna at one point, and there was a guy in the audience, and he was like, as I was presenting, I've never seen anyone who looked so depressed. Like he was shaking his head and looking down. And then when I finished, he came up to the podium, and I was right. He was like, he told me he was incredible. Like my talk made him incredibly depressed. In fact, I think he even mentioned that the word suicide, and not that he was going to commit suicide, but it made him feel like committing suicide. And what was the reason? He's been doing all this iframe research, and I guess I must have convinced him a little bit that we should be changing our research focus. Let me say, I don't think that we shouldn't be doing iframe research. I think it's really important to use psychology to improve individual behavior. Um, but I think thinking about psychology and its role in public policy. Remember, there was that paper, the paper I showed you the matrix from that paper, and I think there's just much more of a role to be played by behavioral science and psychology in public policy. And we can, so for example, we can think about psychologically informed public policies. If there could be a carbon tax, how should it be implemented? Should it be implemented upstream? Should it be implemented downstream? How should it be framed? It inevitably, which is good, it would generate a huge amount of revenue if it was a big enough tax to actually change people's behavior. And what should be done with that revenue? What should be done both to to make the biggest progress on the problem, but also what could be done with that revenue to make a carbon tax most palatable, most appealing to voters. And so my own view is that there's a tremendous role for scientists to play. And for some reason, we got locked in the situation where we thought that what we should be doing is nudging and doing nudge related research. And I think it's really kind of unfortunate that the public, to the extent that they know anything about behavioral economics, when they think about behavioral economics, they think about nudges and they think about that is behavioral economics, and that is certainly behavioral economics and public policy. We have a much wider role that we can play.
That's great. And that, I think, at least partially answers some of the questions that have gotten a lot of upvotes, which are asking things like, do nudges have any place as a policy tool, complementary, should the nature of the problem determine the solution? I mean, you've kind of partially
Yeah.
answered that in the sense of
And
behavioral research has a role in these
and
particular ways.
Judd, can I interject?
Yeah, yeah, please.
I mentioned the paper that we wrote titled "Nudging Out Support for a Carbon Tax," and it's about this issue of crowd out. I think it's not that prominent. It's actually a pretty minor issue in the book, but it's probably the issue that's gotten the most attention among fellow behavioral and social scientists. And one of the things in the last study in that paper, we do an intervention where we tell people how small the impact of a green energy nudge is likely to be. And we explain what it does and we explain how small the impact is likely to be. And when we did that, it actually eliminated the crowd out. When people realized how small the impact was going to be, it no longer crowded out support for a carbon tax. And I think that gives us an important lesson, which is we can be doing nudges in parallel with more kind of substantive types of policies and research on more substantive policies. But we just need to make sure not to oversell nudges. And if we don't oversell nudges, then the nudge research isn't going to crowd out support for more substantive policies.
I like that a lot as a way to have them both. We can do the nudges, but also say this is not the full solution. We need more as well. So one related question that has gotten upvoted a lot and quickly, so I'll ask it. The question reads, I don't disagree that nudges feel like putting band-aids on gaping wounds. However, how does one implement needed systemic change when there are powerful special interests against reforms and without sufficient political will to make the change? This feels like the crux of the problem. I also like this one because it's related to what I said at the beginning of, okay, we're going to tell people there's this S frame problem that you have to change. Like what are the actions that individuals can take, that kind of, what is your mapping between knowing that it's an S frame problem to a solution?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think at an individual level, the implication of this work would be that political activism is more important than trying to shrink your personal carbon footprint. But I think Trump's policies have clearly had a lot of impacts, and many of them adverse. Like, for example, I assume that there's a lot of academics on this Zoom, and we all know that Trump's policies have had an adverse effect on academia. And I think at a personal level, I think that the I've wondered whether the Trumpian shift has decreased the timeliness of our book. And just one more tiny piece of fallout from what's been going on. And I think some people, when I've talked to them about these issues, they've said, isn't this, given what's going on now in the United States, isn't this all kind of pie in the sky? And I do think that we're not, in the next short interval, we're unlikely to have a lot of really great S-frame reform. But I think that one way that I think about it is that if the other political party ever gets back into power, that maybe then that some of our prescriptions could be very useful because I really think we that nudges have been a bit of a distraction, and that we really need to be thinking about fundamental reform in so many of these different areas if we want to solve these policy problems and um, bring people over to our side. That was probably unnecessarily political, but if you think
No, but
about something like inequality, inequality has been getting worse under both Republican regimes and under Democratic regimes. Although I do think it was a Republican regime, Ronald Reagan in 1980, who really like started what's been happening since then in play. But I think we are going to really, if we want to tackle the problem of inequality, we are really going to need some pretty dramatic S-frame reforms.
got it. So what I'm hearing is there's the general advocacy efforts of kind of pushing for the policies we want. Once a party is in power that is implementing the kinds of S-frame solutions that we might think are necessary to solve these problems, then behavioral research can help design these policies and describe ways that things could be framed to be more effective. There's a question that got upvoted a bunch of times, which I think might be a third route to change. It says, what's the unique role of behavioral science in promoting corporate and public sector systemic reforms? So
Mhm.
I wonder if you have thoughts on this of like whether we have something, there's this additional party, the, corporate, this relates to another question was, another part of an upvoted question is industry generally against our collective interest, or is there any nuance to that assertion? And I guess both of these are asking, do we have a role in trying to get these corporate actors who have the way you've described them kind of been working against our interests? Is there a lever for us to pull with them is how I would kind of group
Right.
these questions together.
I mean, as you can tell from the title of the book, this book is very, very critical of corporate interests in the economy, and not only fossil fuel industry, but a lot of other industry. For example, the health insurance industry. And I mentioned that I am just about to finish the book, Broken Code, about Facebook. And I think that's a great example of industry. Like the moment we had a rightward shift in government, you can see what happened. I think it was somebody who was a Trump advisor just became appointed to as president of Meta, I believe, something like that. Corporations tend to blow with the wind. And when maybe there are some good corporations out there, like Patagonia, maybe, but in general, corporations tend to blow with the political wind. I don't think the solution to any of these problems lies with like well-meaning corporations turning things around. I think that if we change the system, we can change the incentives on corporations to make it more likely that they will take actions to turn things around. And the Facebook story is really interesting because almost every time that political pressure was applied to them, and they got afraid, they became afraid of regulation. This is both in the United States and in other countries too. They very, very quickly started to reform their ways, introduce different filters and other kind of high-tech solutions to reduce misinformation, to reduce polarization, and so on. So I don't think that corporations themselves are the answer, but I
We
believe in the capitalists. I do
yeah.
believe in the capitalist system, and I think that with the right incentives in place, corporations could play a constructive
Yeah.
role.
I think that's a great place to end, and we are at time. I'm going to turn it over. We're going to get a slide with the new events. I was going to put the link to the book again, but I was beaten to the punch. And so while people are clicking to Amazon to buy the book and looking at the upcoming talks, which are all excellent, let me just say in closing, we hope you've enjoyed today's book talk, that you'll join us again for one of the upcoming seminars. The schedule is here. We want to thank George for generously sharing his time and wisdom with us. And if you'd like to stay in the loop about future events, make sure to subscribe to the CHIBE newsletters or follow CHIBE on Blue Sky or X. So thank you all for joining us. Thanks again to George, and we hope to see you at a future event.
Thanks for the great questions and for introducing. Okay.